There are still some empty seats if people would like to take them, because we do love a full house. Thank you. And there's a couple of other seats there, so please come, girls. There's a sexist comment for you. Come on, girls. You can have a seat. Thank you all very much. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. If I've not met you, my name's Kathryn Greiner. I'm the chair of Penington Institute, and we're delighted to have you with us for the inaugural Penington Oration. In welcoming you, I recognise and acknowledge that we are on Wurundjeri land. Now, that's quite difficult. I'm a chick from Sydney, so I'm used to saying Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. So the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation. And we acknowledge the elders, past and present, and we acknowledge the winds and the waters and the lands which we all share. To the Penington family, to Sonai, to Tony, to the family who's with us, can I just say thank you for agreeing to the oration. We'll speak more about David in a moment, but we were delighted when you gave your agreement. And we're just tickled pink that so many of David's colleagues and friends have been able to join us today. To the ministers in the room now, I'm sorry, I am an ignorant New South Welsh girl, and you can probably just have ignorant and the rest of it flows on. But Minister Ingrid Stitt is here representing the Premier. Deputy Premier Ben Carroll is with us. I also have to say, in particular, our host for today is Matthew Hulakari. And I think, Matthew, can you just put your hand up for a moment if I can see you in the back of the room? Without Matthew's assistance, this would not have happened. Now, normally in a room like this, I would actually introduce and identify every politician in the room. Every parliamentarian, and can I say, they come to us today across the political divide. So this is an issue that I think spans the Parliament and is of great interest to all of us. So if for all the parliamentarians in the room, could you please put your hand up? Thank you. Marvellous. They're all there. Thank you. And thank you for your interest and thank you for your time. It's been great to have you with us. Can I just say to our patrons, our chief patron, Sir Gus Nossal, it's for me a joy beyond belief to see you, Gus, and also to Professor Ian Gust, who was a board member with us not so long ago, but is now a patron of Penington Institute. And I bring apologies from Michael Kirby, who's travelling overseas, and also from Professor Suzanne Corrie, who is unfortunately taken ill this week, but she had planned to be here up until yesterday. So to our patrons, we thank them for their support and the work that Penington Institute does. To the board, my board members are here in the room. I won't identify you. You can put your hands up now. Carmel and Nick Lanzeros, Professor Nick Lanzeros and Dave Stewart, who's not only a great philanthropist, fundraiser, but he's my gym buddy as well. He's a lot fitter than I am. Might be a bit younger than me too. David Penington, and to the CEO and the staff, John Ryan. Everybody knows John. To the staff who've done the most amazing job getting us all here together. So thank you for the work that you have done and you continue to do. Please make sure you take a pamphlet which was on the table where we got our name tags if you didn't pick one up at the time, and that tells you in greater depth. But I'm limited to 4 minutes and I've got one to go. David Penington was, by all accounts, the most outstanding of Australians. He sought to empower, not himself, but for those who struggled from ill health, those who struggled, whether it be through vision impairment, through hearing impairment, those particularly in the HIV/AIDS area, for whom David had the greatest compassion and persuaded all of us to have great compassion at a time of great uncertainty. And of course, he understood the issue of drugs. He was a true humanitarian. He understood that the way we have been dealing with drugs all our lives, and mine's probably longer than a lot of you in the room, is really a failing that we now must redress. And he was an outstanding public intellectual. And I know the family misses him greatly, but we are very proud of the work that David did, and we were very honoured in 2014 when David gave permission for us to use his name. There are two men who are not strangers to this house. I call them 43 and 44. And I'd like them to give an occasional remark, looking at former Premier Kennett, 43. But if Jeff Kennett and Steve Bracks could join me here on the podium, I'd like Jeff as 43. The best way to do that was 43, 44, do it seriatim, and then Tony Penington will give a reflection on the family. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Steve.
Good. Well, thank you, Kathryn, Soné, Tony, family members, my successor, 44, ladies and gentlemen, and Deputy Premier, where are you? Up the back. Good to see you, Ben, and current members and previous and intellectuals, of which I am not one. Steve and I could tell you a million stories about this room, but I've been told I've only got 5 minutes. It was here in 1976 that I took my seat in the Parliament for the first time. In our time, there was considered debate. Under Labor, when they occupied this room, it was covered in blood. They had to repaint it. Can I say it's a great privilege to be here today, because for those of us who have served in a place like this or in Canberra, regardless of our politics, we followed in the wake of people who were bipartisan in the work that they did and brought specific skills to those of us who were lay people but parliamentarians to assist us in better understanding the subjects of the day. And David was one of those men. As Kathryn said, he was a great intellect, but he was more than that because he was a great human being as well. And without going through his record, the two things that stand out in my mind in terms of public service here and overseas was his work on AIDS at a time when AIDS were new to the community, and he was brave enough to stand up and lead here and around the world, and of course in terms of drug reform. One of my predecessors, I don't know what number he was, Henry Bolte, I used to meet with him for, I was going to say a glass of whiskey every now and then, but I've got to say it was a bottle of whiskey with Henry. He always said to me, never have an inquiry unless you know the result first, which was very good advice to parliamentarians. And I only really ever had one, and it was David Penington that I looked to have that inquiry. And that was into drug reform in Victoria in about 1997, somewhere around that period. And I remember speaking to David in advance of our thoughts and trying to direct him a little bit as to where he might end up. But he was very independent in everything he did. And at the start of that inquiry, I was in favour of decriminalising marijuana. So was David. And when the report came down, I think it was in about 98, there was that recommendation that we move to decriminalise marijuana. By that stage, I had come to understand better the impact and the potential damage that marijuana excessively used or marijuana that was impure or too powerful could do in raising the psychosis within the individual taking it. So when David's report came down recommending decriminalisation, it was the only part of the report that we never accepted. I never accepted. And I cannot tell you, even today, years later, a quarter of a century later, almost, I feel as though I let David down. I really do, because he put his heart and soul into that report. He knew where we started, But by the time we got to where he'd finished, I had, of course it was a government decision, but I had some control at that stage, my decision not to go on with it, and that ultimately led to the establishment of Beyond Blue. And the beauty of David is represented by the fact that 43 and 44 are here today. Not just because we follow one another of different sides of politics, but Steve also, in 2000, reached out to David Penington for him to be able to continue work on drug reform. So this institute represented an individual who had the best of personal values. Whether it was in commerce or whether it was in science, he spread his knowledge generously around the world, but particularly here in Australia. And I will be forever grateful for having known him and the standards that he set, not just for us in public life, but for his children and his grandchildren. You can often ask yourself, what would I have done, or what would my predecessor, or in this case David, have done in circumstances? So the other day I had a final dinner with Mark Beeson before he passed on, a wonderful individual, left Europe after the war, came here, died 2 weeks ago. And for his great family, given now all the disruption that's happening in the Middle East, to be asking yourself, when confronted with circumstances, what should we do? What's the standard by which we think and operate and deliver? And David Penington set for me one of those great standards. I hope this institute has a long life, because what David was so good at, and what so many of you in this room who were his colleagues intellectually have done, is give we who are broader in our knowledge, less focused in our specifics, you give us the authority and the opening to solutions that this community is always going to be looking for in a whole range of areas. So thank you for the opportunity. Let me now introduce my very close friend, Steve Bracks, who is number 44.
Thank you, Jeff. There's a first for everything. Being introduced by Jeff Kennett is a first for me. But Jeff and I do share many stages. And thank you, Kathryn. It is, in some ways, as Jeff mentioned, a testimony to David Penington that you've got the podium shared by premiers from different sides, from Jeff Kennett and Steve Bracks, and that's a great thing. Can I acknowledge the Penington family? MPs from both sides of the chamber, particularly the Deputy Premier Ben Carroll is here, the many eminent scientists and academics here today, distinguished guests one and all. So it is an honour to say a couple of words. I know we've only got 5 minutes, got that, to say a few words about the courageous legacy of Professor David Penington. David Penington was indeed a fearless, brave man. He was a man of conviction who provided advice to successive governments, as we've heard, on drug policy in Victoria, advice that politicians and department heads don't often want to hear. For example, his courageous advice, which he gave to the Kennett government and to my government, to have supervised injecting facilities. It was a Sir Humphreys moment. A Sir Humphreys moment in that it required bravery, and I think the advice I got from the head of my department at the time was actually to say that would be a brave move, Premier. I knew in code what that would meant, but that was David Penington, rigorous in the sort of advice he would give. And based on his advice to the Kennett government, I didn't hesitate, as Jeff mentioned, to commission David Penington to chair a drugs policy expert committee to examine new approaches to the worsening problem of illicit drug use in Victoria. In November 2000, when he gave me the first report, less than 5% of our drug budget was directed towards prevention programs. It seems a scandal, really, when you look at it today. On that occasion, I did ignore the Sir Humphreys around me and supported Professor Pennington's recommendation to trial supervised injecting facilities, and it's great to see that subsequent governments have now implemented that. It was just one of an integrated set of strategies which include prevention, rehabilitation and support services. As a result of David Penington's advice, we lifted our prevention effort to 25% of the additional $77 million we invested in drug abuse in our community. We doubled the number of available treatment beds and cut the waiting times for withdrawal and detoxification services. I have no doubt, actually, that David Penington's recommendations saved thousands of lives. It's wonderful that this courageous legacy continues in the work of the Penington Institute, which continues to drive drug policy reform. Friends, David's courage first became evident in the public eye in the 1980s when he led the Hawke government's response to the HIV/AIDS crisis as chair of the National AIDS Task Force. His influence in that role was profound. He ensured AIDS was treated as a medical rather than a social problem. He implemented a national needle exchange program for drug addicts, and that wasn't a simple thing, by the way. It was extremely controversial, the needle exchange program. It caused a lot of angst, but, it was the first time ever in a jurisdiction in Australia that this had happened, and every other state followed as a result of the needle exchange program that he recommended. He also chaired a national committee of inquiry that was instrumental in the introduction of Medicare. Not a bad achievement, really. And he worked for the Red Cross, including 7 years as the chair of the National Blood Transfusion Committee, in which time he set up blood transfusion aid programs in Nepal and China. We are very fortunate that Dave was born in Melbourne. And apart from his years at Oxford and a spell as a doctor in London, he lived here in Victoria. We are fortunate because we got the benefit of his tremendous intellect, his compassion and his commitment to public life. North Richmond Community Health, which services migrants and refugees, exists only because of David Penington and his advocacy in the 1970s. He was an institution at the University of Melbourne, 17 years as a Professor of Medicine, 8 as the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Services, and 8 as Vice-Chancellor from 1988 to 1995. His term as Vice-Chancellor coincided with the Hawke government's education reforms, and David handled that with aplomb, as he always did. When he left the University of Melbourne, I was delighted that he agreed to head our push to make Melbourne a biotech mecca. In 2010, David agreed to be the chair of Neuroscience Victoria, formed just a year earlier to facilitate technology transfer and inward investment into Melbourne's neuroscience cluster. We also convinced him to chair our $400 million Bio21 project in Parkville. He was the go-to person for all that. And astonishingly, David still found time for his passion for the arts. He chaired the Melbourne Museum and oversaw the relocation to the Carlton Gardens, and he helped establish the Australian National Academy of Music and was a lifetime supporter of the Melbourne Theatre Company. He was an outstanding Australian. Of course, he is greatly missed, but I have no doubt Professor Penington's courageous legacy will continue to influence Victoria, Australia and the world for the better for decades to come.
Thank you. And now I'd like to ask Tony to join me here on the stage for a few personal reflections. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you very much. It's a great honour for me to stand up for the family and represent the family, and thank you to John, to Kathryn, to the board and to everyone at the Penington Institute for this wonderful occasion to commemorate my father. I've been asked to say a few words about him from a more personal standpoint. My father was a public intellectual. I think we've heard that. He was an able administrator, which is a compliment, actually, an extremely able administrator. But above all, he was a doctor. His family was medicine. He studied medicine initially in Melbourne and then in Oxford. And he chose to study haematology, which was a very exciting specialty at that time because people were curing cancers which hadn't been cured before, and they cured it not by finding the answer, but by implementing treatments that they just incrementally over years, including his practicing lifetime, each time doing that made things better. And he had a very lucrative practice in London at Harley Street, had patients from the Middle East. He was doing very well, and he chose to come back to Melbourne in 1967 to take up a university appointment, a big cut in income and a big change in his life, but he had that commitment. I actually remember the first time he was in the public eye. When I was a child, he was in the papers and on the television for a proposal for people with alcohol abuse who develop something called Wernicke's encephalopathy, which is not due to the alcohol, it's due to vitamin B deficiency, because they get the calories from alcohol, so they don't have a good diet, so they have vitamin B deficiency. And he said, why don't we buy vitamin B1 in beer? This was a big deal, and this was a bit surprising to people. He was on the television, and it was very exciting to see it out on television. The novelty of that wore off over the next 20 years. And he was in the paper, the man in the news, that my mother cut out for us in the paper. But, of course, as we've heard, he went on to do many, many things in public life. But I think everything he does actually is there in that initial thing that he did, because for Dad, he liked to solve a problem. He could see a problem, he could see a solution, he just wanted to implement it, and that's what he did. He would have made quite a good surgeon, I think, if he hadn't been in a position. And it just seems so hard to do when you have a problem like that, to be able to see what is the right thing to do, and why could he do that. And one of the reasons, I think, is that people see a problem like the alcohol and beer, and they B1, and they want to fix everything. They don't realise that you can just fix part of the problem. And he understood that that's what you have to do. Especially they want to fix other people's moral failings, as they see with alcohol and so on. He didn't see life that way. He had a strong moral sense, as we heard. As a child, he had a period where he was very intensely religious, a period where he flirted with communism. But I think the values that drove him through life, in fact, for me, the values of medicine, being a doctor, and those were his values, that you care for people, whoever they are, whatever they are. It doesn't matter what they believe. You just have to help people, and that's what he did. And that was his philosophy in life. But also, first do no harm is a sort of funny thing in medicine, but people think, well, don't hurt people, which is, well, in chemotherapy you can keep it, you are going to hurt people. But really it says that's the baseline. Not harming is the baseline. If you do something that makes people better, that makes things better, do that. Do it like they did with cancer. Just keep doing it. You keep doing it. You measure your outcomes. You keep doing things better. Over time, you can really make real change. And he understood that whatever the field is, you just try and make things even a bit better. If you can keep doing that through your life, you'll make a big change, and he certainly made a big change. Dad had so many interests, of course, but in his later years, I think it was drug policy which really interested him. It was what he cared about. He was delighted to be asked to be the name for the Penington Institute. I think it was a wonderful thing. He really cared a lot about drug, and I think if there's any area of public policy where that clarity of purpose is needed, is valued, it's in drug policy. He was very proud of the work that John does. I have immense respect for John and for everyone at the Institute, the work you do at the Institute. Very proud of the importance of the work that's done at the Institute with such an important problem. So on behalf of the family, especially Sonai, but all of us, the Penington family, we're immensely grateful to you all, to John, to Kathryn, the board, to everyone here. Thank you so much for this wonderful day. Thank you.
And the genius lives on. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the family. And it's there in all of them. And it's a privilege for me now to talk a little bit now about the Oration, which is the reason why we're here. And just in case you're not familiar with Parliament House, and I'm not, the bells ring at 2 o'clock, which is why I was trying to keep 43 and 44 to time. So if the bells ring, but we are planning on having the speeches finished by then, the Oration concluded by then, but please stay and join us for a cup of tea after that. It's my great pleasure now to introduce the inaugural orator for the Penington Oration. Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police for 7 years, Michael Palmer, but known mostly to all of us as Mick Palmer, aided and abetted by his wonderful wife Kay, who I've had the joy of meeting yesterday for the first time. And Kay, thank you for coming to Melbourne. There you go. Old habits die hard. Thank you for coming to Melbourne to be with us today. Mick is the Commissioner for 7 years of the Australian Federal Police, as I noted. He's a barrister. He's a consultant on security. There is actually nothing that Mick has not seen from both sides or all sides of the drug issue. And it's my great pleasure to invite Mick Palmer to give us the inaugural Penington oration. Thank you, Mick.
Thank you, Kathryn, very much. Thank you to everybody for coming today. Just honouring the Penington family. Lovely to have a chance to meet with you and for you to be present on this occasion. It's a pretty hard act to follow when you follow not only Kathryn but Jeff and Steve and then Tony, so you'll have to bear with me if you don't mind. I'll try to stick to time, Kathryn. But I'm honoured and genuinely humbled to have been asked to deliver the inaugural David Penington oration, and I feel seriously enormously privileged to have been given that opportunity. I knew Professor David Penington and admired him, as did so many others. He was a man who throughout his life demonstrated real leadership, as others have said, in many areas of deep community concern and controversy, a quality, I suggest, that is in desperately short supply in so many areas of contemporary society. Never shy of engaging in a contest of ideas and committed to evidence-based research and practice, he really did leave a genuinely courageous legacy. Hoping to draw on this legacy, I thank members of the Penington Institute and guests here today for giving me the opportunity to speak about a number of matters that I believe need to be discussed more widely and considered to enable us to grow into a more sensitive, compassionate, caring and fairer society. It's by talking on occasions such as this, I believe, that we can reflect on the best of our past, but also challenge many of our behaviours and traditions and practices of the past to ask, are they still relevant, or should they have been put in place in the first place? Should they be revisited and updated as we strive to make a better future? Generally, when I'm introduced, it's as I was today as a former commissioner, which is true, but I was also a former recruit, probationary constable, uniformed constable and detective sergeant, and my journey in policing was a long one. And when I think back on my career, my operational career of some 20 years was far more valuable to me in terms of educational and in terms of soberingly analysing the reality of the community of which we are part and which I served than was my time as a commissioner. It was when I had feet on the ground that I understand now, and I didn't always understand at the time. I learned so much more than I did as commissioner. I joined the Northern Territory Police in the 1960s, so as old as some people are here today, I'm older, in the days when you had to be male, single and 21 to join. I was required to live in male-only barracks accommodation. I needed the approval of an inspector to be absent from my barracks after 1 a.m. and needed a commissioned officer's approval to get married. I had a colleague, in fact, who submitted a report seeking permission to marry a lovely local girl who I knew personally, only to have his application rejected by the inspector because he didn't like the family. They were the good old days, as Paul Keating said, but perhaps they weren't so good at all. No doubt the rules made sense to the powers that be at the time, no matter how discriminatory, counterproductive, even ridiculous they appear to be now. The reality, of course, is that some of them were ridiculous even at the time. While they were introduced for perceived good reasons in the main, they were very often introduced without adequate thought or consideration, particularly of the impact or the consequences. The focus almost invariably was on the symptoms, with almost no thought or examination seemingly given to the causes or the impacts. Sadly, and I suggest far more seriously, this same accusation can be levelled at many of our criminal laws that have been enacted over the years. It's a salutary exercise, I believe, to reflect on the situation to see if lessons can and should be learnt from history, so as not to be repeated in the present or the future, to attempt, as did David Penington, to make sure we do leave a courageous legacy. As an example, when I joined the Northern Territory Police, the offence of ward drink liquor was in force. It was a law solely focused on Indigenous Australians, which provided that Aboriginal people whose names did not appear in a citizens' register, which was a government gazette-style publication, that listed all Aboriginal people who had been declared or deemed to be citizens, were otherwise classified as wards. If your name wasn't in the book, you were a ward. He says, losing his place. As such, they committed an offence simply for drinking liquor. The offence of ward drink liquor, for simply drinking alcohol. Offence for which they were likely to be arrested, very likely to be arrested, and even imprisoned. The law was only repealed, in fact, in 1967. Albert Namatjira, by the mid-1950s, a highly renowned painter, internationally renowned painter, in fact, was arrested and imprisoned for 2 months for war drink liquor in 1958, simply for providing an alcoholic drink to an adult family member who was a ward of the state under the legislation. Albert had been awarded a conditional citizenship, got to think about that, but this did not allow him to supply alcohol to anyone who was a ward under the law. His sentence to 2 months' jail resulted in him... Sorry about that, I've just turned 2 pages over at once. He never recovered from his time in prison, and in fact he died less than a year later at the age of only 57, which was really pretty tragic. As a constable in the 1960s, I frequently worked evening shift, during which in Darwin, a city then of only about 16,000 people, between 70 and 90 Indigenous Australians would be arrested for ward drink liquor every evening shift, most nights of the week. Sometimes over 500 arrests in a week. Most nights of the week that occurred. In the vast majority of such cases, the person arrested were not committing any other offence other than having a drink. The complaint would come from licensees or staff of the hotels in the main, complaining about Aboriginal people being on licensed premises and drinking alcohol from almost empty beer glasses left on tables by other patrons. The behaviour itself screamed out for consideration of the reasons. Why are they doing that? But the focus was solely on the behaviour, solely on the symptoms. Looking back, my attitude then in simplistic terms, as with most of my colleagues, I think it's fair to say, was you do the crime, you do the time. We don't make the laws, we simply enforce them. When I look back and reflect on that, of course, that was a simplistic cop-out really at that time. The clear intent of the war drink liquor law was to protect Indigenous Australians from the damage and danger of alcoholism and to stop and deter them from drinking alcohol. The reality, of course, was it did neither, because it focused simply on the symptom and did nothing to address the causes of the problem. Indigenous people still drank alcohol, the only difference was they were likely to be arrested for it, and often imprisoned for doing so. I remember an Aboriginal person by the name of Banana who was quite frequently arrested 3 times in one day. Be arrested, be bailed, and would be arrested 3 times in one day. Obviously a hopeless alcoholic with no support at all, who went around finding places to drink beer and getting arrested for it because somebody would complain about his behaviour. Surely such early operational experiences caused me to question, of course, the law more broadly and ask whether some of the other behaviours addressed in our criminal codes should be crimes at all. I remembered a few instances where it really brought this home to me. I remember being required to question a young man in the Darwin Hospital bed who had attempted to take his own life. He had committed the then crime of attempted suicide. His crime was based solely on his own behaviour in attempting to take his own life. No thought in the prevailing processes was given to the circumstances that caused him to do what he did. No avenue of sympathy or compassion was open in the legal sense for a young man who was clearly in a hugely depressed and zero self-esteem situation. Thanks, Kathryn. And desperately needed help and support. Why anyone would want to arrest, charge and convict somebody in that circumstance, even then, was almost impossible to understand. But we did. The criminal justice system of the time, however, really provided no avenue to support, protect and treat people in those circumstances. The focus was solely on punishment, in the mistaken and simplistic belief, I believe, at that time, that this would act as a deterrent. Attempted suicide, thankfully, is no longer an offence, but it was for a long time. The other issue that came to my mind was a crime then commonly known as buggery or sodomy, covering consensual sex between men, which remained an offence in Australia until at least the late 1970s, with South Australia becoming the first Australian jurisdiction to fully decriminalise the homosexual act on the 27th of August of 1975. Until August of 1975, no jurisdiction had done anything about reducing the criminality of consensual sex between men. In about 1970, I questioned and arrested 2 men for the offence, both of whom were convicted, and one of whom, from memory, served a substantial term of imprisonment. The offences in my early detective days were seen as serious crimes, and this severity was reflected in the prescribed punishments handed down by the court. Sort of astonishing on review, but widely supported across the community at the time, with the perceived seriousness of the conduct, as I said, reflected generally in the penalties imposed by the courts, and the attitudes frequently displayed in support across society. There are gay people living today, including some who are personal friends of mine, who can still remember the abominable crime of buggery, which carried then a sentence of 14 years imprisonment, and the death penalty for sodomy was only removed from the statutes in Victoria in 1949, in my lifetime. It was here. So life for many gay people was very difficult, and it was certainly difficult for many young police officers who, of course, were gay and couldn't come out, as nobody really could. The price of being outed in those days was very severe. Many careers were destroyed and not fulfilled because of the fear of being outed, and suicide levels amongst gay people, even now, are disproportionately high when compared to the rest of society. When you look back, no matter how well-intentioned the decisions to create some of these crimes and laws and penalties were at the time, governments must surely now be prepared to learn the lessons of history, not only in regard to these historical crimes, but also as to what they surely tell us about how careful we need to be in creating new offences or retaining current ones, and how important it is in assessing these issues to thoroughly examine and assess the likely or possible causes and to balance that and them against the perceived or known harms before reaching a final decision. A David Penington approach, if you like. Just as organisations have to change and adapt to the future, so also must our laws, and in particular, our criminal laws. One size will never fit all, and deciding appropriate causes of action for a great range of human conduct is a difficult and a fraught exercise. But it's an exercise that must be done and done well and with care, compassion and courage, and particularly courage, if we are to improve the quality of our criminal law and, critically, the quality of the lives of many Australians impacted by our decisions, if we wish to leave a courageous legacy. Unless, in considering conduct that should be criminalised and what penalties should apply, governments are prepared to assess and consider the likely consequences as well as the reasons why my experience tells me that we'll always chase our tails and the problems we are attempting to address will continue to simply worsen. With the war drink liquor laws, the clear intent at the time, as I said, was to protect Indigenous Australians from the damage and danger of alcoholism and to stop or deter them from drinking alcohol. But it didn't work. It didn't work because it attacked the cause and not the symptom. It attacked the symptom, but not the cause. I would argue strongly that the criminal offence of use and possess cannabis on any objective analysis is similarly discriminatory and damaging and serves no more sensible public purpose than did the war drink liquor law. In saying this, I don't suggest that taking a currently illicit drug, or any drug for that matter, including tobacco, is beneficial or to be applauded, but rather to recognise and accept that the criminal law cannot operate as the social conscience of Australia, and nor should it, and to argue that there are far more sensible ways to correct potentially personally harmful behaviour than through criminal sanction. In 2019, more than 7.6 million Australians, or some 37% of our population, had indicated that they had used cannabis at least once. Most only used the drug occasionally or for recreational or medicinal purposes, and only a very small percentage were considered to be addicted. That is not to suggest, of course, that cannabis use is potentially completely without harm. In the 6 years to 2020-2021, the number of recorded hospitalisations for cannabinoid use increased from 6,000 to 7,500, although looking at the population increase in that time, the figures are relatively stable. Nevertheless, the medical implications clearly are a matter of concern, but I suggest not a concern that can be improved or corrected by arrest and incarceration, any more than we could have ever solved the Indigenous concerns over alcohol consumption and addiction through the use of war drink liquor laws, or reduce the numbers of suicides by arresting people who unsuccessfully attempted to take their lives. You look back at it now and you think, how nonsensical was that approach? During a break from my policing career in the early 1980s, I was admitted to the private bar in Queensland as a barrister, and I commenced practice on the Gold Coast at Southport. I found myself frequently appearing for people on low-level cases, a young, pretty junior, inexperienced barrister, and one occasion sticks with me very closely when I appeared for 5 young men who'd been arrested by police for use and possession of cannabis after neighbours complained about a noisy party in a private house on the Gold Coast. The 5 men were quite happy to plead guilty, but were desperately keen to avoid conviction because of their career aspirations. 2 were trainee teachers, 2 had applied for and been accepted to the Defence Force, and 1 was awaiting a visa to go to the United States on a sports scholarship. Of course, you could scream out, why the hell would you take cannabis with that much to lose, take the risk of arrest? Well, of course, the reason is young people do silly things and young people make mistakes, and the penalty far, far outweighed the crime. The damage caused to them, if they had been convicted, was going to cripple their careers, their aspirations. At those times particularly, a conviction for use of cannabis would have stopped people being accepted to teaching or to the Defence Force, would have killed the visa to the United States for the sports aspirant. It made no sense then, and it makes no sense now, that the penalties were so far out of character with and out of tune with the actual offence, which was affecting nobody else except themselves and probably causing almost zero harm to themselves in any event. As the Penington Institute website indicates, cannabis is not a panacea, and the risks cannot be ignored. However, when it comes to cannabis laws, Australia is long overdue for reform. Data shows that the current prohibition approach is not just failing, it is causing real harm, as did, I suggest, the war drink liquor law and the crime of attempted suicide and consensual sex amongst men. Despite enjoying, on any international comparison, high-quality policing in this country, and despite the almost continuous increase in the number of drug, including cannabis, arrests that are made in Australia, only a tiny proportion of the 3 million plus Australians who use illicit drugs each year are arrested. The usage figures suggest fear of arrest barely rates on the Richter scale. But if you are unfortunate enough to come to attention and be arrested, the outcome can be a very severe whole-of-life personal punishment. Apart from having a significantly discriminatory impact on those arrested, the clear reality is the arrests and convictions make little or no difference to user levels or user habits and do nothing to reduce drug-related harms. The damage done by arrest and sanctions for use and possess of cannabis far outweighs any public good likely to be achieved by the arrest or the possible harm or damage caused to the offenders by the use itself. The reduction in discrimination and the social and racial profiling that so often is directly connected to illicit drug enforcement would be very, very positive indeed from a change of our laws. The statistics make it very clear, and this is clear right across the law enforcement spectrum, that criminal sanctions disproportionately impact Indigenous and minority communities, the homeless and the disadvantaged, and persons suffering depression and other mental health problems. That is to say, the cadre of people most in need of support, treatment and protection are those most likely to be punished. There has to be a better, more effective, less damaging way to deal with people who use cannabis than simply arresting them. As the Penington Institute observes, we believe the best way forward is a strictly regulated market that prioritises safety and health outcomes. On the basis of long and painful legislative history, it seems to me it's a position very hard to argue against. Professor David Penington was a remarkable human being and a humanitarian with a deep concern about people's health and well-being. Whilst there are many wonderful things that could be said about David, and many have been said today, including, of course, as has been mentioned, his leadership role in the HIV/AIDS campaign, his championing of the needle exchange program, and the introduction of the safe injecting centres, his deep overall commitment to human decency, health and well-being across the board, to me, stand tall. His approach and philosophy towards the criminal law serve as a wonderful lesson to us all, in my view. The question of the approval of a second safe injecting centre in Melbourne is, I understand, being considered at the moment. It's an example of an issue which is controversial and difficult for governments, as Steve Bracks mentioned, to manage. David Penington's approach and attitude would, I suggest, be of great assistance in the decision-making process. However, whether or not my or David's or the Penington Institute's reviews are accepted, one clear, unquestionable reality remains, and that is that many laws have been enacted and many decisions made over the years, which in hindsight were clearly discriminatory, clearly unfair, unnecessary, and in many cases very seriously counterproductive. Mistakes have been made that should not be repeated. Governments must be prepared to heed the bad laws' lessons of the past if we are to achieve more positive and constructive results in the future. This will require that they assist and assess the issues under scrutiny much more holistically and more flexibly. They must consider all options and be prepared to genuinely fund and analyse and review both response and prevention initiatives as well as the coalface ones, investing more in alternate and early intervention strategies, and where new strategies are being trialled, committing it to a genuine community education program which operates to quell public concerns and fears, increase community understanding and identify the outcomes attempting to be achieved, not just the sanctions and punishments being imposed. But having said this, I recognise strongly that there are no bad guys in this argument, only concerned guys. Everyone desires the same, and Jeff touched on this with his change of position in terms of David Penington's advice on decriminalisation. Everyone desires the same or very similar outcomes. The issue of crime and meeting the expectations of the community presents a quandary for governments. As currently being dramatically illustrated in a number of Australian jurisdictions, violent youth crime is engendering serious community fear and aggressive demands for immediate corrective action by governments. Violent youth behaviour is frightening many people, and the calls for stronger penalties and a zero-tolerance approach to repeat offenders grow stronger each week, and understandably so. As part of any response, though, it needs to be recognised that police are far more effective in investigating and taking action for crimes that have already been committed than they ever are in dealing with intended or threatened crimes. And as a consequence, police can only ever be part of the solution, and it is critical for governments to recognise and accept this. Quite frankly, in my experience, governments often appear not to do so, and police too often, in my view, are seen by governments as a cure-all, when in fact they can never be. Governments which create new offences, increase penalties and fund additional police resources are likely to witness more arrests and more imprisonments. But if introduced in isolation, the new provisions will do little, if anything, to improve the crime rates. We'll simply lock up more offenders who will serve longer time in prison and probably be released as more hardened offenders than they were when they went in. This simply is history in my experience, and it has never, ever varied. This is not to say we should apply leniency to serious and violent offenders, absolutely not. But serious crime, particularly violent crime, does require serious consequences. But, and it is a huge but, governments must have the courage and the resourcefulness as well as the responsibility to recognise and address the reality that if all they do is lock up the offenders, that is, attack the behaviour or the symptoms and do little or nothing to address the reasons or the causes, we will continue to deal with increasing crime rates, more arrests, more incarcerations and more fear and suffering in the wider community. Concerned citizens are understandably strongly agitating for tougher penalties for violent crimes. But if you were to ask any of them which they would prefer, 1, to see the perpetrator who violently attacked them in their home arrested, punished and imprisoned, or 2, to not have been attacked in the first place, I think the answer speaks for itself. Prevention is 1,000,000 times better than cure, and avoidance beats the hell out of revenge. As Winston Churchill famously said many years ago, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. His comment was seen as a challenge to business leaders at the time to redefine how they measure the success of their own initial initiatives. I suggest this is equally a challenge to contemporary governments. No matter how difficult the challenge may appear to be, no government wants to be remembered for presiding over failure. But delivering good, results-focused government will almost certainly require strong and honest decision-making, open-minded flexibility, and the preparedness to make tough, even unpopular and courageous decisions if the desired outcomes are to be achieved. As an old, you do the crime, you do the time police officer, I've journeyed a long way from my starting position, and it's taken me a long time to get here. However, the facts, I believe, are irrefutable, and the lessons of history are plain for all to see. A Penington Institute-style evidence-based approach to law reform is essential to meaningful reductions in crime, fairer and more equitable laws, and improved community safety and confidence in government. I fully understand it'll take courage for governments to move away from the popularist, quick-fix, prohibitionist approach to crime and crime epidemics and criminal problems, but unless they do so, in all my experience, I know the problems will only get worse and worse and worse. I urge governments to heed the lessons of history, to demonstrate genuine leadership and grab the opportunity to make a real and positive difference, irrespective of the criticisms not infrequently levelled at them. And irrespective of those criticisms, the reality is that the vast majority of politicians are good and decent people who are committed to serving their community and delivering the best possible government there is to deliver. To deliver on these commitments, though, we do need them to show the leadership, courage and commitment to make the correct decisions, not just the popular ones. We all surely have an obligation to do everything we can to ensure we do not continue to repeat the ward drink liquor, the sodomy or the attempted suicide mistakes of the past. If we do this, we'll go a long way towards leaving a courageous legacy. Thank you.
I'm going to get you to come back in a second. I'll get you to come back.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mick. I'm sitting in the front row, almost on Jeff's lap, but I can tell nobody moved. Nobody moved. You had them all in the palm of your hand, pardon the pun.
That's what being an ex-policeman does.
That's what I know. But what Mick has just taken us through is the landscape of laws that were initiated with one view in mind, but absolutely no understanding of the unintended consequence. And what I think behind Mick is the banner about Penington Institute, and it's improving community health and safety. And you do that by taking the community with you, not from above you. And our laws are always enacted that way. The Pew Institute in the United States has changed incarceration laws through something like 24 different states, simply because they went and worked out the cause of why people were committing crimes, and they worked on that solution to prevent the other consequence of incarceration. So we know that changing the way we work does wonders. Penington Institute is absolutely committed towards community safety and the understanding of the issue of drugs in our community. Mick, you've given us a wonderful food. You've got great food for thought. It's like as Mick was speaking, you're going, oh my God, why didn't they see that? You know, it's not just the medical profession. We are all about do no harm. So thank you, Mick. That was a wonderful oration. And in Queensland, you have to remain hydrated. We hope that you and Kay will be able to remain hydrated with this little token of our appreciation for this wonderful oration. Thank you both for being with us today. And look at us, we've done it all before the bells ring. So thank you. Please, there's coffee and tea and some nibbles in the outer area, and otherwise known as the hall. But please stay and have a conversation with us and enjoy the day. You will see that there is, and John Daly knows my little call to action here, there is in your pamphlet, there is a recognition that, of course, we receive very small amounts of government funding. We would love to have a lot more than we do, and in fact we've had some taken away. And that's the world in which we all live. So I do encourage you to think about, when you're thinking across your tax year dollars between now and the end of the financial year, to think about Penington Institute, the work that David started, and the recognition, as Mick has shown us, that we have so much further to go. So thank you for the work that you do in your own lives, but thank you again for being with us, and we look forward to the oration next year and your presence being with us too. Thank you.